All right, our next topic is the community guidelines for shelter program expansion and the supportive housing services proposed work plan for the next fiscal year, which will be year 2. Wow, so that reminds me, it's really only been 1 year. I misspoke in our prior topic because we spent 1 year organizing all of it and now 1 year doing it. All righty, well, we'll turn it over to you, to our housing experts, Josh Kreitz, Jess Larson, and Ms. Janine Smith.
Well, good morning, Chair Harrington and Board. Josh Kreitz here, Assistant Director of the Housing Department. It's great to be with you. And yeah, it has been a fast and furious last 12 to 15 months starting to stand this program up. So we're excited to be here. Today's program update is not a quarterly report, but there are 2 important items that need to come to your board for awareness and continued direction. The first being the conclusion of the work that was directed to us in December, and that was the work of engaging the broad community discussions about our future shelter expansion work and creating guidelines to inform that work. Second, we also have the draft work plan for the next fiscal year. This is a newly required annual report due to Metro each spring. And again, this is a continuation of our local implementation plan, providing updated annual goals for the upcoming year. So we have a full report, so I'm not going to spend much time today. I'm going to turn over to Jess and the team who put together a really good report, and look forward to your questions and feedback at the end.
Thank you, Josh. Good morning, board. Chair Harrington, it's a pleasure to be with you. My name for the record is Jess Larson, and I use she and her pronouns, and I'm your Supportive Housing Services Program Manager. And I'm joined here with our colleagues from the team, Alex Devon and Janine Smith. They'll both introduce themselves when they take on their part of the presentation. Next slide, please. So as Josh outlined for you, we have 2 different programmatic bodies of work that we're bringing forward for your awareness and attention and further direction and feedback today. The first is the community guidelines for our shelter program expansion work, and the second is that new work plan that's due every year. It's a continuation of the local implementation plan, as Josh described. And then at the end of the presentation, we will receive your questions and feedback on both items. Next slide. So getting started with our community guidelines for the shelter program expansion. As you will recall, you asked us as staff to conduct broad community feedback to engage our Washington County community, those impacted by homelessness, those providing services to address homelessness, and the surrounding community of neighbors and businesses concerned about homelessness. We wanted to seek their feedback and engagement, and also provide some information about our growing shelter program work, now made possible with the Supportive Housing Services Program. As you will recall, also in our local implementation plan that we created as our framework for this 10-year program, we made a commitment to achieve 250 new year-round shelter beds. We anticipate this will require between 5 to 7 new sites that will host these shelter programs. And in order to begin that work, we went about this community discussion, if you will, to gather feedback, to provide information, and ultimately to co-create these community guidelines that will be a tool for staff in guiding our ongoing programmatic work in partnership with the community as we identify these 5 to 7 sites and then launch these future shelter programs. So that is the context of this first part of our presentation. And before I turn it over to Janine to walk you through the work and the ultimate guidelines, I want to express just really big gratitude on behalf of our department leadership for the work of both Janine Smith and Ty Schwefferman, and also Jesse Adams and Highland Edelman. They were just a tremendous team that led this big body of work, and Janine is here to represent it for them all. Okay, over to you, Janine.
Thank you, Jess. Salutations, everyone. Once again, for the record, I'm Janine Smith. I use she, her pronouns. I am in Supportive Housing Services and also the Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement. So jumping right into it, I think we need to switch to the next slide, actually. Thank you. The Department of Housing Services and Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement led a robust community engagement process to elicit feedback from Washington County residents, community stakeholders, and individuals experiencing homelessness. Now, for the purpose of this portion of the presentation, it should be noted that when I indicate individuals experiencing homelessness, that may be interchangeably used as impacted people or people impacted by homelessness. This is not to minimize or diminish the reality that community members and stakeholders too are impacted by homelessness or impacted by the homeless crisis. Staff recognize from previous shelter engagement experiences that we must provide upfront and sustained community engagement opportunities. The Department of Housing Services and Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement wanted to ensure that we took a regional approach while gathering feedback to assist with the co-creation of community guidelines for shelter program expansion. In 2 weeks' time, staff utilized several tools such as community engagement events, surveys, polls, newsletters, emails, social media, word of mouth, all of the things to distribute information and collect data. When I tell you, staff made several attempts to reach individuals far and wide throughout Washington County. We exhausted every avenue that we could think of, and it worked. We did not just read the responses, we needed to hear the voices of the people who would be most impacted by shelter programs. The goal was to receive diversity and feedback, and in order to do this, we had to meet people where they were at. This includes the utilization of interpretation services and translated documentation as well. Staff conducted in-person interviews at shelters to reach participants who otherwise may not have had access to other forms of communication. Staff also utilized city and community-based partners to collaboratively support these efforts as well. Next slide, please. The Department of Housing Services and Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement had the capacity to host 4 regional community engagement events, which included Forest Grove, Cornelius, and surrounding areas, Tigard, Tualatin, Beaverton, and surrounding areas, Aloha, Hillsborough, and surrounding areas, and lastly, a countywide event for those who did not or could not attend the other 3 events. Out of the 180 registered participants, we hosted a total of 95 individuals to include, but not limited to, news outlets, city partners, community members and advocates, stakeholders, and individuals experiencing homelessness. During these community events, participants were able to engage in poll questions, breakout room sessions, and surveys in order to ask questions in real time. The consensus from all 4 events were largely in support of the efforts that are being made to ensure transparent communication. Next slide, please. So let's discuss the surveys. As a huge part and one of the most informative tools used to collect data, staff created and utilized 3 different surveys to elicit feedback. The community member survey received 175 responses, which exceeded its goal. The stakeholder survey received 30 responses, which exceeded its goal. And the impacted people survey, which was geared towards shelter participants and other individuals experiencing homelessness received 38 responses, which exceeded its goal. Staff conducted in-person interviews at the Cloverleaf and Beaverton shelters to complete the impacted people surveys. We also used interpreters while out interviewing people as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. After gathering all of this robust information, the question is, what did staff do with all of this compiled data? Great question. The data was compiled and placed into feedback themes to include addressing the unmet needs in our community. So you've heard about the need to expand up to 250 shelter beds. Staff also heard the need for capital funding to support shelters as resources for the acquisition, rehabilitation, construction, and site preparation as they are limited. We also heard that people need access to support. The shelter system needs and would benefit from a comprehensive coordinated system of care. Shelters should be safe. Safety is always a huge concern. Community safety should be addressed through 24/7 person-centered security services. Shelter participants largely feel safer in Washington County programs than being unsheltered, is one of the highlights that we heard while interviewing. Diversity of shelter system options. So creating a diverse and equitable sheltering system with various shelter models and locations can meet the growing need within Washington County. The community should be involved. Community members indicated that it should be important to keep the community informed when future shelter programs are located. It should be noted that many shelter participants expressed how appreciative they were of shelter programs in Washington County. They were so excited, and that was like the highlight of the engagement series for myself. Next slide, please. So now here is the meat and potatoes, the guideline recommendations. The feedback outlined was used to create the following best practices for locating and operating shelters throughout the county. These guidelines will be utilized as county staff and consultants, led property searches, design shelters, and implement programs. Although the community will not be asked every time, a potential location is identified, staff will utilize the co-created guidelines as a tool. These guidelines are very important and is as follows. So access to frequent and reliable transportation. Shelter programs should be located near readily available transportation services to ensure people can successfully access and exit shelter programs. Accessible public transportation is critical to people experiencing homelessness as it assists with applying and maintaining employment, access to education, mental health services, medical services, and meet other needs. Next is access to services, employment, and community resources. Equitable shelter locations would come with low barriers to access services. Access to services assists clients with connection to the community and creates a platform for transitioning back into housing stability. Access to community resources such as food banks, mental health and medical care, outreach organizations, childcare assistance, alcohol and drug recovery support, and supportive services assist clients with maintaining stability as they transition. Access to culturally specific services will also be valued as they help to provide culturally competent support to communities of color, refugees, and immigrants. This is one of the items that a lot of people express that they are interested in during our events. Geographic and demographic distribution. Shelter programs will not be concentrated in low income or neighborhoods where a high percentage of communities of color reside to prevent undue burden. Consideration of potential economic or social stress on neighboring businesses and residents will be made, especially in low-income communities. Geographic and demographic distribution will also include a diverse and equitable sharing system with various shelter models such as alternative shelters and congregate shelters and non-congregate shelter models to create more housing options. Attention to local community impacts. Some locations may not be suitable for shelter programs due to the proximity of other sensitive public areas, such as schools, playgrounds, early learning programs, and public parks. All shelter programs will be designed to partner with the surrounding community and mitigate any changes, and any proximity to sensitive public areas will be examined carefully before proceeding. It should also be acknowledged that sometimes proximity to places like public parks and playgrounds and schools can also be a benefit to a neighborhood as well, or to a shelter program as well. Strong program management. An experienced service provider with abundant staffing, training, and management support is critical to the success of a program, ensuring equitable outcomes for program participants in a surrounding community. Therefore, shelter staff will reflect the diverse populations impacted by homelessness. Ensuring equitable community and participant safety. Once again, proactive, culturally and linguistically appropriate and person-centered security services will be considered to prevent over-policing of program participants and help mitigate community member concerns. Person-centered security service should have knowledge of different cultural norms, responses, and impacts of over-policing in communities of color, as well as refugee and immigrant populations experiencing homelessness. Support community livability. Shelter programs will assist with safe storage of personal belongings, monitoring spillover such as garbage, hazardous materials, and sharps from shelter participants, in addition to community members utilizing shelter grounds as a dump site for garbage or unwanted things. So cleanliness is definitely something that we also want to focus on. Transparent and accountable communication. As previously mentioned, community concerns about shelter programs and unsheltered homelessness will be addressed through frequent, open, and transparent communication, which I believe we've demonstrated with the public and the community local to a shelter program. Identifying neighborhood demographics. This is also important. We utilize mapping tools to help identify needs of a community by understanding considerations such as languages spoken within a home, special religious practices, and household income status. And lastly, co-creating community agreements, which this is an example of. A community agreement process will uplift community concerns and identify solutions that can be agreed to by all parties, including neighbors, program operators, and building owners. Community leaders and program participants will work together to liaise concerns and communications and foster trust and relationship between all parties with each shelter program. I know that was a mouthful, so I will turn it over, and thank you.
Thank you, Janine. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. So as Janine said, that was a lot of work. This can all be found, curated very thoughtfully and clearly in a kind of partner public facing document called our community guidelines. It was shared with you in these board materials, and we are currently working on finalizing this draft. It will be a living document though, as we continue to receive feedback and learn from the processes of helping to locate, engage our community in the surrounding neighborhoods and launch new shelter programs. So today we hope to receive any feedback from you as we finalize this document, and then the next steps from there would be immediately, we've already begun working with our partners in the city of Beaverton and city of Hillsborough and in Tigard, where there are potential sites that have been identified, and engagement work that would begin immediately with the specific surrounding community to start discussing those future programs. And we will also be looking for additional sites. We're challenged with a limitation of shelter services right now because of a lack of sites where we can offer winter shelter programming. And of course, our goal is to get to year-round shelter programming, but I must be frank and say it'll be challenging even next year to have as much winter shelter capacity as we did this year with the limitations we have around locations and sites. So we will be actively working on citing those sites as well in the near future. And of course, any potential site that meets the criteria that is described in these guidelines will be brought forth for further discussion with that local community before any programming is begun. So that is how we plan to use this tool. And those are the immediate next steps for beginning the work of shelter program expansion in accordance with this emerging tool.